Colin Preston was a bland, unassuming-looking little man. He would traipse through the streets in the gloom of the winter evenings, knowing that not one soul that he passed would take note of him. He saw them. He saw every one of them. The larger, more dominant-looking men, the women he could only fantasize about, even the ones he didn't find attractive. But not one of them ever seemed to notice him. And why should they? His colleagues at work barely spoke to him. He knew the names they all called him behind his back. He would hear them talking when they thought he was out of earshot. The Rat Man was a favourite of them, due to his rodent-like facial features. Not that he didn't have such facial features, but his mother had always told him how handsome he was, in his own little way. Colin had, however, given up caring about such things a long time ago. Besides, it was Friday night. He would not have to bear being around those people until Monday morning. He turned the corner onto Newgate Street, as the sky began to drizzle small droplets upon his thinning head. He quickened his pace slightly, as he drew closer to the front door of the little terraced house he called home. He turned his key in the lock, and hurried into the small hallway beyond. As it always did, the smell hit him immediately. He could never place it, but it was a pungent, rank odour that seemed to almost burn the back of his throat. He stood stock still in the hallway, his eyes fixed on the small door handle of the wooden door under the stairs. Thankfully, this evening it was still. With a defeated sigh, Colin stepped into the small living room. As was almost always the case, he was greeted by the sight of Stanley, slumped in the solitary armchair that inhabited the space, like a dark, acrid liquid that had been poured onto it. "You got dressed today," Colin said, as he moved across the room to the television, noticing the grubby dark trousers and matching suit jacket with a dull black shirt underneath. He pressed a large button on the side of the screen, and after a moment the picture came up, and the room was filled with the cheering of whatever game show was being broadcast. Cold, dark, sunken eyes stared at him from beneath Stanley's mop of tangled, greasy black hair. Those eyes always frightened Colin, surrounded as they were by the purple bruise-like rings that separated them from his pale, gaunt face. "I've been waiting for you to come home." His voice was a rasping, croak-like whisper. Colin had thought that one day he might get used to the sound, but no. The sound of Stanley's voice was like ice water creeping down his spine beneath his skin. "I got home as quickly as I could, Stan." He could not help but sound apologetic as the words left his lips. "I'm going out tonight," Stanley smirked, knowing the reaction that would follow. Colin stood stock still. He felt his hands shaking and clasped them together in front of himself. He swallowed hard. I don't think that's such a good idea, Stan." He seemed to stumble over his words. Stanley remained silent, those near-pitch eyes seeming to bore into Colin's very soul. Eventually Colin spoke again, determined to appear more adamant this time. "It's been a long week, Stan," he stated in the firmest voice that he could muster from within himself. "I just need to have a quiet night in tonight. Let's just watch some telly, yeah?" In one fluid and sudden motion, Stanley was suddenly standing before Colin mere inches from his face. Colin stumbled back in shock, almost falling into the television behind him. "You do not tell me what to do, little man," he hissed through yellow rotting teeth. The stench of Stanley's breath alone could have knocked Colin to the floor. "I'm going out tonight," he repeated. "I'm lonely, and I want to have some fun." "What are you going to take with you?" Colin asked, fearing what the answer might be. "Nothing out of the ordinary," came Stanley's cold reply. The rain now fell from the heaven in sheets, battering the two companions as they stood across the street from the Old Harbourman pub. A group of 4 young women stepped out of a taxi and bundled their way into the building, passing the large bald-headed doorman that stood sentinel at the entrance, trying to cover their heads with their handbags as they went. The doorman seemed to say something to them with a warm smile as they made their way past him, but Colin could not tell what it might be. He could feel the glee spreading across Stanley's face without looking. There was nothing more terrifying than that look. He had to dig deep within himself to finally turn to face the spectre-like man beside him. "Please don't make me go in there, Stan," he pleaded. "Would you rather I went in alone?" Stanley replied, as he took hold of Colin's shoulder and shoved him into the road towards the pub. Colin approached the door, feeling very uneasy as he did so. The hulking beast of a man seemed more intimidating the closer he got. Colin could feel his hands begin to tremble once more. His breathing had become heavy, as if he had just sprinted across the road instead of merely stumbling as he always seemed to do. He reached for the door and took hold of the handle. The giant before him paid no attention to him, not even stepping aside to let him past, forcing him to squeeze through awkwardly. At least he was in the dry now, he supposed, as he crossed the threshold into the warm pub. Small round tables littered the area, and at most there were seated anything from 2 to 5 people, all chatting amongst themselves as they each cradled an alcoholic drink in front of them. He trudged across the room to the bar. Every other step he could feel his feet sticking slightly to the ugly brown carpet beneath. He could see the 4 young women clearly now. They were indeed young. Anything from 16 to 19, he suspected. He paused momentarily, halfway between the front door and the bar, just long enough for him to look back. Stanley had situated himself within a small snug some way to the side of the door, his icy dark stare forcing Colin to turn away. As he approached the bar, he could see the girls were just paying for their drinks. 4 pints of cloudy-looking cider, 8 shot glasses with a pink liquid that he did not recognise. Each of them swiftly knocked back the shots with a cheer before taking the pints of cider and moving away from the bar. "Oi, Tracy," screeched one of them. "Get on the jukebox. I need me some bros, babes." The smallest of the girls, a redhead that had clearly plastered her face with makeup to hide her freckles, smiled with a "all right," as she moved away from the group towards the large jukebox in the corner next to the door labelled toilets. "What do you want?" came a somewhat gruff voice that caused Colin to jump slightly. He turned back towards the bar to see the stout man with a bushy brown beard staring at him. "What?" came Colin's feeble reply. The man made an audible sigh before repeating himself. "What do you want?" he said once again. Colin seemed to struggle with his words once again. He hated that this happened on such a regular basis. A drink?" he finally managed. "Yeah, I gathered that," said the man through his beard. "Anything in particular, or shall I just guess?" Colin's eyes darted across the display of upside-down bottles that were decorating the mirrored wall behind the bar. "Large scotch, please, and a pint of snakebite in black." The barman turned to fetch the drinks while Colin waited patiently. Once they were placed upon the bar in front of him, he paid the man, and took them over to the snug where Stanley waited patiently, his eyes transfixed upon the petite redhead at the jukebox. "I like her," he stated, as Colin sat down alongside him. Colin raised the glass containing the scotch to his lips and drained it in one mouthful, just as the first few bars of "When Will I Be Famous" began to erupt from the speakers situated around the room. Her name's Tracy," he replied. "I heard one of the others speaking to her." "Do you think she'll like me?" Stan asked, his eyes still glued on the lithe figure of the girl. Colin shook his head. "As much as any of your other girlfriends, I guess." He looked down at the full pint glass before him in shame, before picking it up and taking a large swig from it. Tracy eventually sauntered over to the table where the other girls had situated themselves, her hips moving in perfect time with the beat of the song that now filled the place. Colin chanced to glance across at his fixated associate. "Please, Stanley." He tried to keep the desperation out of his voice as he spoke, but failed, just as he often did. "I want to go home." A tear had formed at the edge of his eye. Was it fear? Was it the deep sadness that was welling up from the pit of his stomach? Perhaps it was the horrifying realization of what was surely to come. He could no longer tell. But the warm stale breath of Stanley as he appeared suddenly and without warning at his cheek almost caused him to relieve himself in fright. "Do you really?" came that sickly voice right into his ear. "Are you sure?" "You know what'll happen if you do." Colin could feel Stanley's dark matted hair pressed to the side of his face, his nose almost burrowing into his earlobe. "You don't want me to hurt you, little one," Not like last time. You said you never wanted to feel like that again. You said you couldn't bear it. Colin could feel a slow release of breath crawl across his cheek and onto his nostrils, and his stomach lurched within him. I don't want to hurt you, Colin. You're my brother, and I love you so very much. Stanley kissed him then, his broken clammy lips delicately caressing the flesh of Colin's damp brow. You do know that, don't you? I'm sorry, Colin muttered weakly. I love you too. The evening wore on painfully slowly. Colin chose to continue drinking in a futile attempt to remain calm. Yet his hands and fingers continued to tremble uncontrollably all the same. Eventually, as one of the girls from the group made her way across to the bar, Tracy and another of the 4 women headed towards the door that led to the toilets. Stanley rose from his seat, a slow yet pugnacious action that betrayed his excitement. Now, he hissed. Colin jumped slightly, the sudden call to arms catching him off guard. But there's 2 of them, he fumbled his words clumsily. What if... He felt Stanley's cold, clammy hand grip him by the back of the neck and haul him to his feet. No more words were required. There were no other options left. As his feet mechanically delivered him across the pub to the toilet door, he reached into his coat, his fingers curling around the handle of the kitchen knife that he didn't know was there. Yet still, he had somehow expected to be. He pushed the door open and allowed it to close behind him once he'd stepped through into the grubby little hallway beyond. A calmness swept over him then, and he welcomed it with a deep breath. Not long now, he told himself. Besides, perhaps something would go wrong this time, and he would be caught, and this nightmare could finally end. At the far end of the short hallway there were 2 doors situated opposite one another, one with a sign that read men, and the other sign that said ladies. With a defeated sigh, he drew the knife from his pocket and opened the door to the ladies' toilets. Excuse me, mate. He felt a sudden chill down his spine. He turned to see a handsome, strong-jawed face staring at him from the open men's toilet door. Are you lost? The man smirked before noticing the blade at Colin's side. His eyes became wide at the realization of what was happening, and he opened his mouth to cry out. But he was too slow. With lightning speed, the knife had flashed out across the man's throat, and he staggered backwards through the door. Colin followed him through, not taking his eyes from him as he stumbled around from sink to urinal and back again, his hands clasping desperately at the deep cut that had severed his windpipe. With deft efficiency, Colin stepped forwards and rammed the blade of the knife straight into the centre of the man's face, slicing easily through skin and cartilage. For a moment the blade seemed to be stuck there, between the poor unfortunate's bulging eyes, but with a second tug it came free, revealing the now gaping hole where once a nose had been. Almost mechanically, Colin struck twice more, both times in the man's chest. Stanley's cold voice hissed over Colin's shoulder as the man collapsed to his knees in a crimson puddle. What's this? Colin turned to face the question, but his words failed him. Can you do nothing right? Stanley snapped. The man had now slumped backwards onto the floor. The colour had drained from his face, leaving him a ghostly white except for the seemingly never-ending blood that continued to pump from each of his wounds. Stanley stood over the dying man as he choked to death, and then he was still. It was as if he was assessing him in some way, weighing up the dead man's worth. Eventually his eyes met Colin's once more. Tick-tock, little one, he said with cold apathy, the venom in his voice now gone. Colin hurried back into the hallway and through into the ladies' toilets. On the far wall there were 2 wooden cubicles. To Colin's right there were 2 somewhat filthy-looking sinks, and to his left a frosted window. One of the cubicle doors began to open, and Colin instinctively rushed forwards. The palm of his hand slammed into the woman's mouth and nose, sending her reeling back. Her head slammed into the tank above the toilets with a sickening crack as the knife slid deep between her ribs and into her heart. Joyce? Came the concerned voice of Tracy from the neighbouring cubicles. Fucking hell, love, you alright? Colin felt suddenly relieved. In his haste he hadn't seen who had just attacked. Thankful that this Joyce had not been Tracy, he sighed gently as he looked down at her. She was pretty. Colin wondered why Stanley had not wanted this one. She had a lithe figure and full breasts beneath her little black dress, full lips and dark sultry eyes that now stared blindly up at his own. He heard the next cubicle door open and turned as Tracy rounded on him. For only a moment she stared at him in shock before turning to run for the door. The lights in the small room flickered on and off as she tried to escape. She could feel her legs become suddenly heavy as if she were in some sort of hideous nightmare. Unable to lift her feet, she tumbled to the stained floor with a cry. The lights continued to flicker until suddenly, there he was. Standing before the young girl, a cruel yet joyous smile across his gaunt face, was Stanley. She tried to scream, but only a hoarse gasp escaped her lips as Stanley scooped down to haul her to her feet. He gazed almost lovingly at her as he brought her closer to him. No, it wasn't lovingly, but some twisted, malignant version of what he supposed love would look like. He kissed her forehead as she tried in vain to pull herself from his grasp. She looked up into his pestilent features and screamed in silence as his eyes rolled back into his skull and he opened his mouth with a guttural moan. His jaw dislocated as the muscles surrounding it stretched to unnatural lengths. He tipped his head forward, his cracked and now bleeding lips expanding to engulf the top of her head. A pale pus-like substance began to spill from the gaping maw, running down her face and clothes as she now ceased to struggle. Inch by inch he slowly devoured her whole as Colin watched in unconstrained disgust. Eventually he pulled his gaze from the awful sight and stumbled to the window. Looking down at himself for the first time since entering the toilets, he saw the blood that had covered his clothes. He cursed to himself as a single tear rolled down his cheek and he forced open the window. He didn't look back again as he shuffled himself out of the window before falling into a heap in the pub car park beyond with a splash. The rain was hammering down now, more than ever. Across the small car park there was a short wall that led back onto the street. With haste, he made his way over to the chest-high wall that separated the car park from the street beyond and hauled himself over it. Looking to his left along the outer wall of the pub, he could see the bouncer still stood at the door under the cover of the porch. Wrapping his coat tightly around him, Colin turned and made his way back home through the dark Copperport streets. Colin awoke the following morning still dressed in his wet, blood-soaked clothes, the stale sheets of his bed sodden from his slumber. With a strained effort, he lurched forwards and climbed from the bed. He knew there'd be cleaning up to do. Stanley never bothered to clean up after himself. He trudged solemnly down the stairs to the hallway. As he was expecting, there was a large puddle of that same pungent armorial liquid that he'd watched Stanley excrete the night before. He walked past, making sure not to tread on the foul-smelling Icarus substance, and retrieved the mop and bucket from the kitchen. As he returned to the scene, he noticed the handle of the door under the stairs slowly twisting. He leaned up close to the door and spoke as reassuringly as he could. "Please move away from the door." He paused for a moment. "Everything will be all right, I promise." He closed his eyes and listened to the footsteps shuffle away. He will eventually have to go down there. He will have to face her. Her predecessor will need disposing of. He knew this. After all, they never lasted very long. The rot and stinking decay would set in for her too, and then this would all start over again.